March 10th, 1966. A Shau Valley, South Vietnam. Major Bernard Fisher banked his A-1E Skyraider hard left, circling above clouds that covered the valley floor 2,000 feet below. His radio crackled with urgent transmissions. From the Special Forces camp under siege by about 2,000 North Vietnamese regulars, 6 Skyraiders had been pulled from routine missions to provide close air support. Fisher led his wingman and 2 others down through a break in the 800-foot ceiling, into a valley surrounded by 1,500-foot hills bristling with enemy gun positions. The A-1s made strafing runs against hostile troops positioned between the airstrip and the camp perimeter. Then Fisher saw something that violated every calculation of survivability he had learned in 20 years of flying. Major Dafford Wayne, Jump Myers' Skyraider, trailing smoke and fire, losing altitude rapidly, bellying onto the steel-planked runway below. Myers scrambled from the burning wreckage and took cover behind an embankment, 200 yards from enemy positions. The closest rescue helicopter was 30 minutes away. Myers had maybe 5 minutes before North Vietnamese troops overran his position. Fisher understood immediately that the mathematics were absolute. His friend would be captured or killed unless someone landed on that battle-torn airstrip, surrounded by hostile forces firing from elevated positions. What Major Bernard Fisher did next would make him the first United States Air Force airman to receive the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War, proving that the calculated risk of one life for another sometimes defied all tactical logic, except the logic of brotherhood. The A Shau Valley had never seen an aircraft land and take off under direct enemy fire. Fisher was about to attempt exactly that. Knowing the odds against survival approached certainty, but the alternative of abandoning Myers was mathematically impossible to accept. The mission had begun routinely at 800 hours. Major Bernard Fisher and his wingman, Captain Francisco Paco Vasquez, climbed into their A-1E Skyraider's at Pleiku Air Base, with orders to conduct bombing runs against suspected Viet Cong positions in the Central Highlands. The A-1, though designed in 1945 and obsolete by jet-age standards, remained ideal for close air support. Its Wright R3350 radial engine produced 2,700 horsepower, driving the aircraft at 322 miles per hour maximum speed. More importantly, it could carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance on 15 external hardpoints and loiter over battlefields for hours, capabilities no jet could match. The Skyraider had earned its nickname SPAD from pilots who appreciated its durability and firepower. 20 minutes into their flight, Fisher's radio crackled with urgent transmissions, redirecting all available aircraft to the A Shau Valley, the Special Forces camp there, defended by 17 Green Berets and 400 South Vietnamese and Chinese Nung mercenaries, was under massive assault by North Vietnamese regulars. Intelligence estimated 2,000 enemy troops attacking from multiple directions. The camp's survival depended entirely on air support, preventing the perimeter from being overrun. Fisher banked southwest toward coordinates he had flown over dozens of times, but never with conditions this desperate. The A Shau Valley was a tactical nightmare, 6 miles long, 1 mile wide at its widest point, surrounded by jungle-covered mountains rising 1,500 feet on both sides. The North Vietnamese had positioned anti-aircraft weapons on the ridgelines, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered the entire valley floor. An 800-foot cloud ceiling forced aircraft to operate below the surrounding hills, within easy range of enemy guns firing downward. Pilots called it the Valley of Death. Fisher led 5 other Skyraiders through a break in the clouds and descended into what resembled flying through a canyon with hostile forces on the walls. The Special Forces camp sat at the northwestern end of the valley, beside a 2,500-foot steel-planked airstrip. North Vietnamese troops had advanced to within 200 yards of the perimeter. The Skyraiders made low-altitude strafing runs, their 420mm cannons ripping into enemy positions. Fisher could see tracers arcing upward from the hillsides, green projectiles that seemed to float slowly before accelerating past his canopy. Each pass brought the A-1s within small arms range. The aircraft were built to absorb punishment. Armor plating protected the cockpit and engine, but sustained hits could bring down any plane. The close air support was working. North Vietnamese troops withdrew temporarily from positions under direct fire. The Green Berets radioed coordinates for additional strikes. For maybe 30 minutes, the situation stabilized. Then Fisher saw Major Dafford Wayne jump Myers' Skyraider, trailing black smoke from the engine cowling, losing altitude rapidly as Myers transmitted Mayday over the radio. The aircraft was going down, and the only possible landing site was the airstrip below, a runway surrounded on three sides by enemy forces who had spent the morning trying to overrun the camp it served. Myers' Skyraider belly landed hard on the steel-planked runway at about 10:30 hours. The aircraft skidded 200 feet, shedding pieces of fuselage and propeller blades, before sliding to a stop near the runway's midpoint. Fire erupted from the engine cowling. Myers unstrapped immediately and climbed from the cockpit, running toward an earthen embankment 20 yards from the wreckage. He took cover behind the raised ground, 200 yards from North Vietnamese positions that had been firing at his aircraft moments earlier. Fisher circled overhead, watching enemy troops begin moving toward Myers' location. The closest rescue helicopter was 30 minutes away at Camp Holloway. Myers had maybe 5 minutes before being overrun. The tactical situation was absolute. Landing on that airstrip meant violating every principle of self-preservation Fisher had learned in 20 years of military aviation. The runway was littered with debris from Myers' crashed Skyraider and previous aircraft damaged during the siege. Steel planking had buckled from mortar impacts. North Vietnamese forces surrounded the airstrip on three sides, positioned on elevated terrain with clear fields of fire. Any aircraft attempting to land would approach slowly, vulnerable to concentrated small arms fire during the entire landing roll. Once on the ground, the pilot would need to taxi the full length of the runway to reach Myers' position, presenting a stationary target for several hundred enemy soldiers firing from 200 yards away. Then, the aircraft would need to accelerate back down that same bullet-swept runway and lift off before reaching the overrun at the valley's edge. Fisher keyed his radio and transmitted words that silenced every other conversation on the frequency. He announced his intention to land on the airstrip to effect a rescue. He directed Captain Paco Vasquez and the other Skyraiders to provide covering fire during his approach and landing. The response from Vasquez was immediate, affirmative, and the other pilots confirmed they would suppress enemy positions with everything they carried. Fisher committed to the landing pattern, banking his A-1E into a descent that would bring him onto a runway no pilot had ever successfully landed on and taken off from under direct fire. The pilot's code was simple and absolute. You don't leave your own behind. This wasn't doctrine written in manuals or orders transmitted through chains of command. This was culture forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. Every pilot understood that the men who flew beside them would risk everything to bring them home if they went down. Fisher had known Myers for months. They had flown together, shared the same ready room, understood the same risks. The mathematics of rescue defied tactical logic, but followed a deeper calculation. That brotherhood mattered more than survival, that some debts could only be paid by accepting odds that approached certainty of death. Fisher lined up his approach on final, reducing airspeed to 90 knots as he descended toward the steel-planked runway. His fellow Skyraiders made strafing runs along both sides of the airstrip, their 20mm cannons hammering enemy positions. Green tracers arced upward from the hillsides. Fisher could hear rounds impacting his aircraft's armor plating. He was committed now. The other pilots circling overhead understood they were witnessing either the most extraordinary rescue of the war or the moment when two good men died trying to accomplish the impossible. Fisher's main landing gear touched steel planking at 10:32 hours. The impact jarred the aircraft as he applied brakes. Immediately, steering around jagged holes torn in the runway by mortar fire, smoke from Myers' burning Skyraider obscured visibility. Small arms fire crackled from the hillsides on both sides of the valley. Fisher could hear rounds striking his aircraft's fuselage, sharp metallic impacts that signaled enemy gunners had found their target. The other Skyraiders dove repeatedly along the ridgelines, their cannons hammering positions 200 yards from where Myers waited behind his embankment. The suppressing fire bought seconds, nothing more. The tactical challenge was absolute. Fisher had landed on a 2,500-foot runway littered with debris from Myers' crashed aircraft. Pieces of propeller blade, sections of fuselage, and rocket pods torn from external hardpoints lay scattered across steel planking already damaged by mortar impacts. Fisher's Skyraider weighed 11,000 pounds empty, carried additional weight from remaining ordnance, and required precise control to navigate obstacles at taxi speed while under continuous fire. One blown tire, one piece of debris jammed in the landing gear, one critical system hit by enemy rounds would end the rescue, and likely cost both pilots their lives. Fisher taxied nearly the full length of the runway, steering around shell holes that could collapse landing gear or damage the propeller. His tail section struck debris he couldn't see, tearing metal but not compromising flight controls. He spotted Myers behind the embankment and applied brakes, sliding the Skyraider to a stop 30 feet from the downed pilot's position. Myers hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, unable to believe what he was witnessing. Then he ran from cover toward Fisher's aircraft, head down, as enemy rounds kicked up dirt around his boots. Myers reached the right side of Fisher's two-seat A-1E and climbed into the vacant right seat designed for observers on training missions. He had no parachute, no helmet, no communication equipment. Fisher didn't wait for Myers to strap in. He released brakes and applied power, accelerating back down the runway they had just taxied. The Wright R-3350 radial engine roared at full throttle, driving the propeller through air thick with smoke and dust. Enemy fire intensified. North Vietnamese troops realized what was happening and concentrated fire on the aircraft accelerating toward them. 19 bullets struck Fisher's Skyraider during those 3 minutes on the ground. Rounds punched through the fuselage, damaged the tail section, and struck the wings. One bullet passed within inches of Fisher's head. The armor plating designed to protect the cockpit absorbed impacts that would have killed both pilots in an unarmored aircraft. Fisher gained airspeed, watching his instruments climb toward takeoff velocity, while dodging debris that could shear landing gear or damage the propeller. At 90 knots, he rotated and lifted off at the runway's overrun, barely clearing trees at the valley's edge as he climbed through continued ground fire. The rescue had lasted about 3 minutes from touchdown to liftoff. In those 180 seconds, Fisher had accomplished what no pilot in Vietnam had attempted, landing on a battle-torn airstrip under direct enemy fire, loading a downed airman, and taking off successfully despite concentrated small arms fire from hundreds of hostile troops. The mathematics were simple and profound. 3 minutes separated Myers from capture or death. 3 minutes of calculated courage had altered fate through skill, timing, and absolute refusal to accept the alternative. But as Fisher climbed his damaged Skyraider towards safer altitude with Myers beside him, the battle below continued. The Special Forces camp was being overrun. North Vietnamese forces had advanced to within 50 yards of the perimeter. The 17 Green Berets and 400 indigenous troops were running out of ammunition, and the valley floor had become a kill zone where rescue helicopters couldn't operate. Fisher had saved one man. Hundreds remained in jeopardy. and the A-Shau Valley would claim more lives before the day ended. The Special Forces camp at A-Shau held through the afternoon of March 10th, but only barely. The 17 Green Berets and about 400 South Vietnamese and Chinese Nung mercenaries who manned the perimeter had been fighting continuously for 36 hours. Ammunition reserves were depleted, casualties exceeded 50%. North Vietnamese troops had advanced to within 50 yards of the command bunker. Only continuous air support prevented complete overrun, and the Skyraiders circling overhead were running low on ordnance and fuel. The A-Shau Valley held strategic importance far beyond its isolated location. The valley sat astride infiltration routes from Laos into South Vietnam's northern provinces. North Vietnamese forces used the corridor to move troops, weapons, and supplies southward, along what would later be called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Controlling A-Shau meant interdicting that flow. Losing it meant conceding a major supply line to enemy control, but the camp's isolation made reinforcement nearly impossible. The nearest friendly forces were 30 miles away across mountainous jungle. The single airstrip, now damaged by mortar fire and littered with wreckage, couldn't support the transport aircraft necessary to bring in reinforcements. The defenders were effectively surrounded by 2,000 enemy troops, with no realistic prospect of relief. By 1500 hours, the decision was made to evacuate. Continued defense served no purpose beyond trading American lives for ground that couldn't be held. Air Force and Marine Corps helicopters staged at Camp Holloway received orders to extract survivors. Once airstrikes suppressed enemy fire enough to allow helicopters to land. The Skyraiders and F-100 Super Sabres that had provided close air support all morning began systematic bombardment of North Vietnamese positions surrounding the camp. Napalm turned sections of jungle into walls of flame. High explosive bombs cratered enemy trenches. The bombardment created temporary windows for extraction, measured in minutes rather than hours. The helicopters came in under fire. CH-34 Choctaws and UH-1 Hueys descended through the 800-foot cloud ceiling, into a valley where every ridgeline held enemy guns. They landed on the damaged airstrip, while door gunners returned fire at muzzle flashes on the hillsides. The evacuation was chaotic and costly. 5 Green Berets had been killed during the siege. 12 were wounded. Of the 400 indigenous troops, only 172 made it to the helicopters. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered into the jungle, where most would die trying to reach friendly lines. The last helicopter lifted off at about 1700 hours, as North Vietnamese troops overran the camp perimeter. The North Vietnamese paid for their victory. Post-battle assessments estimated 800 enemy casualties from airstrikes and ground combat. The Special Forces defenders had inflicted losses at a ratio of about 10-1, despite being outnumbered and surrounded. But strategic mathematics operated differently than tactical ones. The NVA could replace 800 casualties. The United States couldn't maintain isolated camps deep in contested territory. When every reinforcement required air support and every resupply mission risked aircraft and crews. Fisher's rescue of Myers had saved 1 man, while the larger battle claimed hundreds. This raised questions about what constituted success in warfare, where tactical victories produced strategic ambiguity. Fisher had accomplished the impossible through courage and skill, but the camp had fallen, the valley had been lost, the infiltration routes remained open. Yet Fisher's action would resonate beyond A-Shau in ways neither he nor his commanders understood that March afternoon. His rescue established precedents for combat search and rescue operations throughout the Vietnam War, proving that pilots would risk everything to bring their own home, that the brotherhood forged through shared danger transcended tactical calculations, and that sometimes saving one life mattered more than any strategic objective, because it demonstrated values that defined American forces regardless of battles won or lost. The ceremony took place in the East Room of the White House on January 19th. 1967. 10 months after Fisher's rescue at Shau, Major Bernard Fisher stood in dress uniform before President Lyndon B. Johnson, assembled military leadership, his wife Riala Jane, their 6 children, and fellow airmen who had flown beside him. The room held witnesses to an honor that Fisher found profoundly uncomfortable. He had done what any pilot would do, what the code demanded, what brotherhood required. Now that action was being elevated to the nation's highest recognition for combat valor. The Medal of Honor represented more than decoration. Established by Congress in 1862, the medal recognized conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The standard was extraordinary by design. Thousands of acts of courage occurred during combat. The Medal of Honor distinguished actions so exceptional, so selfless, so clearly undertaken despite near certainty of death, that they transcended normal expectations of military service. A deliberate review process examined witness statements, after-action reports, and command recommendations to ensure only actions meeting that exceptional standard received the medal. Fisher's rescue had been reviewed by Air Force leadership, the Department of Defense, and ultimately the President. Secretary of the Air Force Harold Brown read the official citation. The words detailed the tactical situation. 2,000 North Vietnamese regulars surrounding the Special Forces camp, 800-foot cloud ceiling limiting maneuverability, hostile gun positions firing down on aircraft operating in the valley below. The citation described Fisher's observation of Myers's crash landing, his decision to land on a battle-torn airstrip despite awareness of extreme danger and likely failure, his successful rescue under heavy ground fire that struck his aircraft 19 times, and his liftoff at the runway's overrun. The citation concluded, Major Fisher's profound concern for his fellow airmen and at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty are in the highest traditions of the U.S. Air Force and reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of his country. President Johnson draped the sky blue ribbon around Fisher's neck. The medal itself, a 5-pointed star suspended from an eagle with wings spread, rested against Fisher's chest. Johnson spoke briefly, noting that Fisher was the first United States Air Force airman to receive the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War. The President praised Fisher's courage and character, then addressed broader themes. America's servicemen deserved the nation's best because they represented the best of the nation. Their sacrifice demanded recognition, support, and memory. Fisher accepted the medal with humility that characterized his entire career. He understood that the medal recognized not individual glory, but values shared by all who served. That pilots didn't abandon their own. That brotherhood transcended self-preservation. That duty sometimes demanded accepting odds that approached certainty of death. Fisher had acted according to code that existed before him and would endure after him. The medal honored that code as much as it honored his execution of it. But as Fisher stood in the White House receiving the nation's highest tribute, the war in Vietnam continued. American forces were deploying in increasing numbers. Air operations expanded across Southeast Asia. Fisher's rescue at
Shau had established precedents that would shape Air Force combat rescue doctrine for decades. His action proved that landing under fire, while extraordinarily dangerous, remained possible when helicopters couldn't reach downed pilots. The willingness to attempt such rescues became embedded in Air Force culture, expressed in the motto adopted by Air Force Pararescue, that others may live. Fisher's 3 minutes on a battle-torn runway had demonstrated that some things were worth dying for, and bringing a fellow pilot home was foremost among them. The analysis began quietly in Air Force training centers and operational planning offices, months after Fisher received his Medal of Honor. What he had accomplished at Shau challenged conventional wisdom about combat search and rescue. The accepted doctrine held that helicopters conducted rescues while fixed-wing aircraft provided cover, but Fisher had proven that when helicopters couldn't reach downed pilots, Properly trained pilots in durable aircraft could land under fire, effect rescue, and take off successfully. This wasn't theory. This was documented fact, witnessed by multiple pilots, and recorded in after-action reports that detailed every second of the rescue. The A-1E Skyraider's performance at Shau vindicated the aircraft's continued service, despite being obsolete by jet-age standards. Designed in 1945, powered by a Wright R3350 radial engine instead of turbojets, capable of only 322 miles per hour maximum speed compared to jets that exceeded 600. The Skyraider appeared antiquated, but Fisher's rescue demonstrated capabilities jets couldn't match. The aircraft's durability meant it could absorb punishment that would down less robust planes. Its payload capacity and ability to loiter for hours over battlefields made it ideal for close air support and rescue operations. Most importantly, its low-speed handling allowed precise landings on damaged runways where jets required longer, clearer strips. Air Force para-rescue units studied Fisher's rescue meticulously. The mission became case study material for training personnel who would conduct combat search and rescue throughout the remainder of the Vietnam War and beyond. Fisher's coordination with other Skyraiders providing covering fire demonstrated how proper air support could suppress enemy positions enough to create windows for rescue. His navigation of a debris-covered runway under fire proved that exceptional piloting skill, combined with detailed knowledge of aircraft capabilities, could overcome tactical disadvantages that seemed insurmountable. The rescue validated the principle that drove Air Force para-rescue operations: that others may live. Fisher had embodied that principle through actions that transcended training and entered the realm of moral courage. The legacy extended beyond tactical doctrine into cultural values. Fisher's rescue demonstrated that pilots would risk everything to bring their own home. This wasn't new. Military aviation had always emphasized brotherhood and mutual protection, but Fisher's action at Shau crystallized those values in a way that resonated throughout the Air Force. Generations of pilots who trained after 1966 learned Fisher's story as defining example of what the service expected: that when a fellow airman went down, you attempted rescue regardless of odds. That brotherhood mattered more than self-preservation. That some debts could only be paid by accepting risks that approached certainty of death. Fisher retired as colonel in 1974 after 26 years of service. He returned to Kuna, Idaho, purchased farmland, and spent the next 4 decades raising seed corn, sugar beets, wheat, and alfalfa. He avoided publicity, declined most speaking invitations, and lived quietly among neighbors who knew him as the farmer down the road rather than the Medal of Honor recipient. When asked about his rescue at Shau, Fisher consistently deflected attention from himself to the values that motivated his action. He had done what any pilot would do. The medal recognized not personal glory, but shared principles that defined military aviation. Fisher's landing at Shau lasted 3 minutes from touchdown to liftoff. Those 180 seconds had saved Myers' life, established precedents for combat rescue operations, and demonstrated principles that would influence Air Force culture for decades. But the deeper truth was simpler and more profound. Fisher had proven that courage measured in seconds could alter fate measured in lifetimes, and that some actions transcend tactical calculations to become statements about what humans will risk for each other when brotherhood demands it. The question remains fundamental and unanswerable through tactical analysis alone. Why would a pilot risk near-certain death to save one man? The mathematics suggested Fisher should have circled overhead, maintained radio contact with Myers, and waited for helicopters that might arrive in time or might not. Landing on that airstrip defied every calculation of survivability, every principle of risk management, every rational assessment of odds. Yet Fisher landed without hesitation, not because he lacked understanding of danger, but because he understood something deeper than danger. The pilot's code exists in culture rather than regulation. No manual specifies that pilots must attempt suicidal rescues. No order commands them to land under fire when helicopters cannot operate. But the code operates with force exceeding any written directive. You don't leave your own behind. This principle emerges from shared danger and mutual dependence that defines military aviation. Pilots understand viscerally that any mission could end with them stranded in hostile territory, waiting for rescue that might never come. That knowledge creates bonds transcending normal friendship. The pilot flying beside you isn't just a colleague, but the person who will risk
everything to bring you home, and you owe them the same absolute commitment. Fisher's decision at a Shau wasn't individual heroism, but cultural expression. Any pilot in his position with his skills would have made the same choice, because that's what the code demands. This doesn't diminish Fisher's courage. Executing the rescue required exceptional piloting skill, timing, and composure under fire that few possessed. But the willingness to attempt rescue wasn't unique to Fisher. It defined every pilot who internalized the code. The brotherhood forged through shared danger created obligations stronger than self-preservation. Myers would have attempted the same rescue if Fisher had crashed. Captain Vasquez and the other Skyraider pilots circling overhead would have landed if Fisher's attempt had failed. The code operated independently of individual personality or circumstance. This code exists across all military services and throughout history. Infantry soldiers risk exposure to retrieve wounded comrades. Medics run through fire to reach casualties. Naval crews abandon relative safety to rescue sailors in burning compartments. The principle remains constant. Some things matter more than survival, and bringing brothers home is foremost among them. This isn't absence of fear, but commitment to values that transcend fear. Fisher understood the odds. He heard rounds impacting his aircraft. He saw enemy troops advancing on Myers' position. Fear existed, but remained subordinate to duty informed by code that valued brotherhood above self-preservation. The courage Fisher demonstrated wasn't recklessness or glory-seeking, but calculated acceptance of risk in service of values considered more important than survival. This represents heroism in its truest form, not seeking danger, but accepting it when circumstances demand action aligned with principles you cannot compromise, without betraying everything that defines you. Fisher could not abandon Myers, because doing so would violate the code that made him a pilot. That created bonds with the men he flew beside. That separated military aviation from mere employment flying aircraft. Fisher's Medal of Honor is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, alongside his A-1E Skyraider. Visitors can see the aircraft that absorbed 19 bullet impacts during 3 minutes on a battle-torn runway. The display includes Fisher's flight suit, photographs from the rescue, and the official citation describing his actions at a Shau. But the medal and aircraft symbolize more than one man's courage on one day in 1966. They represent eternal principle that some things are worth dying for. That brotherhood demands absolute commitment. That courage means accepting impossible odds when the alternative is abandoning values that transcend survival. Fisher's landing lasted 3 minutes. The principle it demonstrated endures across generations, proving that ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things accomplish them when guided by codes stronger than fear, and obligations deeper than self-preservation.